We continue now at the top of Daf Nuntas Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 59a. On the previous Amud, Rava wanted to make a distinction between Nizke Mamono and Nizke Gufo, and he wanted to say that by Nizke Mamono, for example, let's say an animal damages a field, so then you evaluate the damage b'shishim, meaning 60 times the amount. There are different ways to calculate exactly, but the point is you figure out the damage based on the value of the larger field. How much was the entire field worth before? How much is it worth now? In this fashion, the mazik doesn't have to pay as much as if you would just evaluate the produce that was damaged. And he wanted to say that that's the case by Nizke Mamono. However, by Nizke Gufo, we're actually more strict on the mazik. We would say if the person himself damaged the field, so then you don't do it b'shishim, you do not do it by multiplying by 60. And Abaya said to Rava, why do you want to make this distinction between Nizke Gufo and Nizke Mamono? So there's a brisa which seems to indicate by Nizke Gufo it doesn't mention anything about Shishim. Maybe that's your proof. But Abaya goes on to quote a brisa which also doesn't mention anything by Nizke Mamono, and clearly by Nizke Mamono it is Shishim. And the Gemara now is in the middle of the brisa. The brisa here continues. Achla Smadar, let's say the animal eats Smadar. Rashi says Smadar is Anovim and Dakim, that's small grapes. Right when they start to blossom, right at the beginning, so he eats those unripe grapes. Rabbi Yoshua says, Ronoson ki ilu hein anovim omdos libatzer. We view it as if they are grapes that are ready to be harvested. The Chachamim say, Rowan Kamma ha'isayafa, the Kamma hiyafa, we say how much was it worth and how much is it worth now. And Rashi explains, V'kama hiyafa hakarkali mocher kishehi smadar ulahakel bo. The point of the Chachamim over here is to say how much was the land when it was smadar, how much was it worth, and the idea is to be a little lenient according to the Chachamim. We're looking at the land, but again, it doesn't say shishim over here either. That's going to be the point. And the brisa continues, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, B'amed devarim amurim, when is that true? Bizman sha'achla lulave gefanim v'yichore ta'enim. That's only true if it ate the branches, the vines of the vineyard, or if it ate again like the branches of the fig tree. Aval achla pagim oboser, but if it ate pagim oboser, this means to say again a situation where it is ripened somewhat. Rowan osan ki'ilu anavim omdos libatzer. So then we do view it as if it was grapes that are ready to be harvested. And Rashi explains, B'amed devarim amurim b'nishomen agav karka. When are we lenient that we do the evaluation according to the larger land, the larger property? Bizman sha'achla lulove gefanim. That's true again when it ate these vines of the vineyard. Hoeshkolos nira b'chanitas hagefanim v'nikar v'adayin lo parach. The point is you can see the clusters there on the vines, but they haven't started to blossom. Lios ha'anavim gemurim, that they're not yet full grapes. V'hu lulav, that's what we mean when we say lulav. V'chein yichor b'te'enim, that's what we mean by yichor by te'enim as well, the same idea by figs. Aval achla pagim b'te'ena o boser ba'anavim, but let's say it's pagim by te'ena, or it's boser ba'anavim, which means shehein kepol halavan, that's like the white bean. V'have keperos gemurim, the point is they're already like fully formed, they're almost like fully formed fruits. So then rowan osan. So then in that situation, we're going to be more strict, and we're going to treat it as anavim omdos libatzer. We're only lenient again in the very beginning of the blossoming. And the Gemara continues, Katani mihas. Nevertheless, what does it say in this brisa, which is talking about nizke mamono? It's talking about animals. The language used is v'chachamim omrim rono san kama ha'sayafa v'kama hiyafa. That the chachamim say we look at it what the land was worth and what it's worth now. V'lo katani b'shishim, and it doesn't say anything about 60 times the amount, but it's assumed it has to be. It is talking about 60 times the amount. Elamayis lach lememra. What are you going to have to say this brisa means? B'shishim, of course, it means that we're evaluating the land using this multiple of 60. So hachanami b'shishim, so too when it comes to Nizke Gufo, it would be b'shishim, and so that's why Abaya is challenging Rava and saying, why is it that you're making a distinction between Nizke Gufo and Nizke Mamono? It can't be because of the language of the brisa by Nizke Gufo. The same language is used by Nizke Mamono. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Rabbi Yossi Haglili v'Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad. Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Yishmael, they're saying the same thing. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yossi Haglili hadam, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili, that's what he said on the previous Amud. Rabbi Yossi Haglili said if you have a situation where the animal eats fruit that is not fully grown, that's not totally ripe, but we value it based on what it is going to be worth when it is fully grown. That's what Rabbi Yossi Haglili said on the previous Amud. And Rabbi Yishmael says the same thing as we learned in the following brisa. The brisa says, Meitav Sadeo, Meitav Karma Yishalem, that you have to pay from the best of the field, from the best of the vineyard. And what does that mean to say? Meitav Sadeo shall nizik, Meitav Karmo shall nizik, Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. It is the best of the field of the nizik, meaning you evaluate based on the property that the nizik owns, the best of the vineyard of the nizik. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, Lo bo hakasav ela ligvos l'nizakin min ha'idjus. The pasuk means to say that when it comes to damages you collect, you pay from the best of the property. The kal v'chomer lahektish, and certainly that is true when it comes to hektish. This is a machlokes Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Akiva that we had earlier in the Mesechet. And so the Gemara now explains, V'lo teima k'Ravidi bar Avin. Now don't say that the explanation of this machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva is like Ravidi bar Avin said. D'yamar Ravidi bar Avin, because Ravidi bar Avin, he explained, Kegon she'achla aruga bein ha'arugos, that there was a certain patch of the field that was eaten among the different areas of the produce. V'lo yadina ni kachusha havoi, shmeina havoi, and we don't know whether the animal ate from the inferior part of the land, or maybe it was from the fat, the good part of the land. D'amar kum shlim shmeina b'meitav. And that's what we're saying. No, the person, we don't know what exactly was eaten, and we say the person has to pay from the best of the land, from the fattest part of the land. The iko that exists right now before us, dahachi lo amin, because that's not true. We don't say that. No one would say that if you don't know what was damaged, the person has to pay the greater amount. My time, what's the reason? Hamotzi mechaver all of araya, because there's a rule. Hamotzi mechaver all of araya. If someone's trying to collect money from someone else, he has to bring the evidence. Ella b'meitav de la kameh. Rather, what it means is meitav de la kameh, meaning if the animal eats from something that's not fully grown, we evaluate what it will be worth later on when it is fully grown. Umayni, and what does that mean to say? Again, kihech tesalika means what is going to be produced, and so therefore you see the same exact idea. That's exactly what Rabbi Shmuel is saying. And Rashi explains, Linizakin min ha'idjus, when it comes to nizakin, you collect from the best of the land. Osa shuma shashamu bezin, when bezin evaluates in terms of monetarily how much was the damage, meya or masayim, it was 100 or 200. Yigve karka b'meya o b'masayim min ha'idjus shabin chasav. You collect the land, again, at the value of 100 or 200, but from the very best of the property. And again, then you have this machlokus between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says you evaluate according to the field of the nizik, and Rabbi Akiva says you evaluate l'nizakin min ha'idjus v'kal v'chomer lahekdish, but we're focusing right now on Rabbi Shmuel. And Rashi explains, v'lo tema d'hai meitav shel nizik to come Rabbi Shmuel. Don't say that when Rabbi Shmuel says the meitav of the nizik, v'kashal in the parakama, we ask in the parakama, we ask in the first parak, Achla kachusha meshalim shmeina, doesn't make sense to say that if the animal eats from the worst part of the field, you're going to have to pay from the best part. V'tirtza Ravidi, and then Ravidi answered, kagon sha'achla v'chulu, that this is exactly the case, we're not sure. The hamotzi mechaveiro olav haraya, then we said no, the rule is hamotzi mechaveiro olav haraya, kachusha meshalim, and you actually would pay from the inferior part of the land, you wouldn't pay from the better part of the land in a situation of suffix, in a situation of doubt. Elamai meitav de nizik to come Rabbi Shmuel. So rather, what is instead when Rabbi Shmuel says meitav de nizik? What does he mean? Lav besveika mari. We're not talking about a situation of doubt. What it's really saying is as follows. Osa aruga sha'achla, that aruga, that part of the field which was eaten, yishalim kifim masha haisa ru'uya lehetiv ulhashbiach lekame. We have to pay according to what it will be worth when it fully grows. Kihech desolik mimos hakatzer. What's it going to be worth at the time of the katzer, at the time of the harvest? And so the idea is that Rabbi Yishmael, just like Rabbi Yossi Haglili, he evaluates the damage according to what the produce will eventually be worth should it fully have grown. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Bamed Devarim Amurim, when is it true that we evaluate the damage in the context of the larger field? Sha'achla lulav v'gefanim v'yichoret einim. That's true by when the animal eats the branches of the vines or it eats the shoots of the fig tree. And that would imply hasmadar, but if it eats the fruits when they're just beginning to bud, that's a little bit of a later stage, then roan osan kilo anavim omdos libatzer. Then we would view it like grapes that are ready to be harvested. We would view it as if, what was it worth when it would eventually ripen? Ema Seifa, but the Gemara now says, let's look at the Seifa, let's look at the end of that line in the Brisa. Achla pagim o boser, if it eats the fruits when it's pagim or boser, which is a later stage of the development. So hu de roan osan kilo anavim omdos libatzer, only then do we say that we view it as if it's grapes that are ready to be harvested. Hasmadar, but if it would be at the early stage of budding, roan osan kama hi yafa v'kama yafa, then we would look at the land, how much was it worth, and how much is it worth now, and how much was it worth before. And so therefore it seems to be a contradiction in terms of this opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara says, Amar Ravina says, Kroch v'tani. What you have to do is you have to kind of put those two phrases of the Brisa together as follows. When is it true? It's only true that we evaluate in the context of the greater field when the animal ate the branches of the vine or the shoots of the fig tree. But if it eats it when it's just budding, or when it's like half ripened, pagan or boser, then roa no son, kilo anavim, omdos li batzer. So then we view it again as if it is grapes that are ready to be harvested, meaning to say there's no real distinction between smadar, pagan, and boser. But the Gemara says, if so, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, hainu Rabbi Yoshua, then isn't Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda saying the exact same thing as Rabbi Yoshua? He also said that that's the halacha when it comes to smadar. And the Gemara says, Ika beinayu, the difference between them is kechash gufna velo mesaimi. The difference is when the animal eats the fruit off the tree, so the fruits of the tree actually weaken the vine, and so when those fruits are eaten, there is a certain gain in value because the vine itself is actually stronger. So do we take that into account and we say the damage isn't really as much because the vine got stronger when those fruits were eaten? That's the difference between Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda and Rabbi Yoshua. One takes that into account and one doesn't. However, that's what the Gemara is saying, V'lo Mesaimi. We don't know which one is which. And the Gemara continues, Abaya says, Mesaimi, we can identify which one of these Tanoim, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda or Rabbi Yoshua, takes into account the fact that the vine is no longer weakening. How do we know? Because man tana dechayish lekechash gufna, who's the one that is concerned with this idea of the weakening of the vine? Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. It's actually Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in a different context, but we see Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda has this same idea. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, onus in a situation of rape, eino mishalim esatzar. So he's paying for the damages. The person who did the rape is paying the woman for the damages, so to speak, but he does not have to pay for the pain. Why? Because in the end she's going to have that pain anyway when she gets married with her husband, and therefore you see already in Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda over here, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, that he's taking into account the fact that in the future that pain will be there anyway, and it's the same idea over here. He's taking into account what's with the vine. The vine would have been weakened had the fruits been there, and now it's not. He would take that into account as well. In any case, this brisa continues, Amru lo, they said back to him, meaning they said back to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, that doesn't make any sense. Really, the pain should be paid for, because eino doma nivelis baratzin, there's no comparison to a woman who has relations willingly, nivelis ba'onis, to a woman who has relations, but it's a situation of rape. There's certainly more pain in the second situation, and therefore the tsar does have to be paid. And Rashi explains, kechash gufna, the weakening of the vine, lenachos minat hashlum, and it means you actually get to subtract from what the person is paying for the damage. Masha yachishu anavim begafanim im yamdu, because you figure out what would the grapes cause those vines to weaken if they continue to be there. Im yamdu sham harabotzer, if they stay there until the harvest. Shetamid yonkim lichluch hagefen, because they're always taking the nutrients from the gefen, from the vine. Abai Amar Mesaimi man tana dechayish lekechash gufna Rabbi Shimon. Abai says we could identify who's the one that takes this into account. It's Rabbi Shimon, because we see that he says this in another context. Again, he says anyway she's going to have that pain. That's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. You see that you deduct from payment according to what in the future would have been that weakening that would have occurred. You see the same basic idea. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Hani Tanoi Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Amru Davar Echad. The following Tanoim and Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, they say the same thing. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Hadei Amar. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, that's the Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda we just quoted above, who takes into account these future events. He takes into account that a vine without the grapes, for example, is not going to weaken as much, and you can deduct that from the payment of the damages. Similarly, by the tsar, when it comes to the tsar of the woman who's raped, we take into account that when she gets married anyway, she'll have that tsar, and you can deduct that. So that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is the same as the following Tanoim. Hani Tanoim Mahi. Now, which Tanoim are we referring to? The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, as follows. Rabbi Yossi says, Nechi Chaya. Rabbi Yossi says, in a situation where a person injures a pregnant woman and causes her to miscarry, so you can deduct the amount that she would have had to hire a midwife had she given birth. Now she's not going to be giving birth. There is no midwife, so you can actually deduct that amount from the amount that they have to pay. Ben Azai says, Nechi Mizonos, that the person who injures her, he can deduct the amount of Mizonos, meaning if she would have been pregnant, she has to be given more Mizonos, more food because she's pregnant. Now the husband is not going to have to give that. They're not going to have to take care of those Mizonos. You can deduct that from the payment. And it's the same idea. We're taking into account the future savings and deducting that from the amount. And the Gemara says, Man damar nechi chaya. Now, the one who says you can deduct the midwife, kol shekain nechi mezonos. Certainly you can deduct the mezonos, the extra food. Uman damar nechi mezonos. Now, the one who says you can deduct the food, avol nechi chaya lo. But to deduct the midwife, that you can't necessarily do. The Amar le, because the husband can say to him, Ida sadidi, that my wife, pekichahi, she's a wise woman, v'lo mi boy chaya. The point is she doesn't need a midwife. Maybe she won't need a midwife, and therefore you can't deduct it. And the Gemara continues, Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua Ovid Uvdo Kavased Rav Nachman. Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, they paskin like Rav Nachman, meaning b'shishim, meaning when they would evaluate the damages in a field, they would multiply by 60. They would evaluate in the larger context of the field as a whole. Lishna Achrin, another version, Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua Shamu Dikla Agav Ketina. That Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua did not do that. They would evaluate the date palm, the damage to the date palm, according to the small amount of land that surrounded it, agav ketina diara, according to the small amount of land around that date palm, and they wouldn't do it by 60. But the Gemara says, V'hilchasa kavase de Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua b'dikla de arama. The halacha is like Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua. It means, simple pshat, the first version of Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua by the date palm, the Aramean dikla, so by the Aramean date palm. So there we will say that we'll evaluate the damage by multiplying by 60 in the context of the greater field. However, v'hilchasa kivase de reish galusa b'dikla parsa. But the halacha is like the exilarch that's on the previous summer, the reish galusa. When it comes to a date palm, a Persian date palm, those were more valuable, and you would actually evaluate those on their own, not in the context of the larger field. And the Gemara says, Eliezer Ze'ira, and we'll take a look at Rashi over here. And Rashi explains, Nechichaya, you can deduct the amount of the midwife, but May Valdos Kamairi, again, we're talking about the value of the offspring by a case where a person injures a woman and causes a miscarriage. You're deducting the amount that the husband would have paid to pay the midwife. And Rashi explains, now the damage to the woman, because right now she was injured and she had more pain now than if she would have given birth with a midwife. To the woman, that's who you pay the nezik and the tsar, the damages and the pain. That includes everything. You're paying for the full damages and the pain. Now, in terms of the money that you're paying for the lost offspring, that's what you actually pay to the husband, not to the wife. From that's where you deduct the value of the midwife. Nachim mezonos, and then the other opinion was you deduct the value of the mezonos. Shutzarach lahosav al mezonos ishto, we make kishua, v'ashtein kishua. Again, you're going to have to add on, give her more food in a situation where she's pregnant. Alma menachinon mashu asad lahotzi. The point is, you see that you deduct based on what the future cost, based on those savings. Dikla parsa, when it comes to the Persian date palm, chashav hu ma'od, that was very valuable, v'nisham b'fnei atzmo, and that you can value on its own. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis.